Hey, I wanted to take some time to talk to everybody a little bit about NAT. So we're heading into this chapter, chapter 9. Some of you, I think, have already started it. Some of you are just getting started. So I kind of thought I would walk through some of the components here. As I mentioned in the remind message that I sent out to you, NAT is really important. So I've taken the CCNA exam 5 times, I think, something like that, and I've always had it as one of my scenarios. So when we were actually having to complete hands-on and do some troubleshooting, NAT was always one of those that was chosen for that. So I want to take a few minutes to talk to you. So getting into the chapter here, I'm going to kind of talk to you just like I would in the classroom and see how this goes, see if it helps anybody. Now, you know back from 125 that we have a private address range and a public address range. Well, the private address ranges are listed here for classes A, B, and C, and these are the ranges of addresses that are used within a network. Okay, so we use our public address ranges outside of a network. So that's an example here. Now, in the middle, you would need to have a router that would enable those addresses to actually be translated from an inside address to an outside or a public address, so private to public. So this is another example here. So the way this works is that you have this private address space, and do you see how it also encompasses the router that's inside of your network, and it has a private address? You see these are all private address ranges, okay? And then this exit interface on this router would actually have a public address and be part of the public address space. So this is the NAT-enabled bordering router. It's a bordering router because it's on the border of your network. So that's kind of where it would be and a little gist of how it works. Now there is some NAT terminology that can be kind of hard to understand, so I would suggest spending some time on your NAT terminology. You have inside addresses and outside addresses. Okay, so looking at your definitions here, you have your inside address. The inside address, the address that's being translated. So in this example, it would be PC1 being translated. Okay, so the outside address is the destination device. Your local address is the address that appears, how it is seen by the inside of your network. And of course, the global address is the one that's seen on the outside of your network. So putting that terminology together, you have these 4 different types of addresses. You have inside local address. Again, that is the private address assigned to your devices within your network. The inside global address, okay, it's inside your network, but it is the public address, or it's the address that's seen from the outside world. They don't see your private addresses, they only see your public addresses. Then you have outside global. Okay, with your outside global address, these are the addresses outside of your network. A lot of times the global and local, outside local addresses will be the same. But again, this is the address as seen outside your network. It is the global or your public address. Okay. And notice this is outside local addresses or outside the scope of the course. They don't really talk about it too much, but typically your outside global and outside local addresses are going to be the same. So for example, they'd be your web server here. So they're not ever, going to be translated. They will typically always be the same address. Again, now it works by taking this private address, okay? When it gets to that NAT-enabled router, it's switched over to a public address and goes to the device. The device can also reply, and they would reply back to that public address. It goes to the NAT-enabled router, and then of course it gets translated back to your private address. I would suggest you do that terminology that I just clicked through to practice that for your exam. Now there are different ways that NAT can be configured, and you see these listed here. So you have static, dynamic, and you have PAT. Static addressing, I'll show you an example of that here. Static addressing is where you have, oh, here we go. Sorry about that. Go down to the bottom here. You have the same address every time. So 10.10 would always be 209.165.200.226. 10.11 would be 209.165.200.227. It would be like that every time. So much like a static address that you would configure on the PC to be the same every time, you would do it the same for NAT as well. Dynamic is kind of like receiving a dynamic IP address instead of a static address, where that could be different every time. You would create a pool. So think about a DHCP pool. Okay, you're going to use the same concepts for a NAT pool as well, where you're going to exclude addresses you don't want in there, just like you did for DHCP. You'll create a NAT pool to exclude the addresses you don't want, and then the numbers that you do want to be allowed to translate. You're actually going to put together what you learned for your access control list, where you write permission statements or deny statements. You're going to do the same thing here. And then you're going to put together the information that you learned about DHCP in creating a dynamic pool for NAT. PAT is very similar to dynamic NAT. The only difference is you don't have a one-for-one translation for that. So what do I mean by that? Well, with dynamic, for every address that you have that's private, you have a public address you can translate to. That does not have to be the case for your PAT. It's basically just overload. It's dynamic addresses in an overload setting. Look at this, for example. NAT table with overload. If you look at 209.165.200.226, look how it's both the same address. The only difference is the port number. Remember, if you have an IP address and then you have the port address, that's called a socket. Okay. Well, if you change the port number on this, it makes it a completely different address as far as the device is concerned. Okay. So what they've done for consistency here is if they were sending something, say, from the 192.168.10.10, and it was using 1555 as the socket number, it was changed to 209.165.200.226 and then 1555. So they tried to keep that consistency. Same thing here with 1331. Now, if that same port number is not available, what they can do is just choose the next available port. So in this case, 192.168.10.12, port number 1444, okay, and that's used. Well, then you have the next device that comes along using that port number. That one's not available, so it uses the 1445. So again, see the difference here between using dynamic NAT. So you have 10.10 is always .226, 10.11 is 227, 10.12 is 228. In this case, 10.10, port number 1444 becomes that number, port number 1444. If the 10.11, 1444 is not available, it becomes 1445, uses the next available port number, and so on. Okay. So you have a packet tracer. They're configuring that. Now, need to know the advantages and disadvantages of NAT, because that's often asked. So the advantages is that it does help conserve some of your addresses with your addressing scheme. So for example, at PCC we have a Class C license. Well, as you know, a Class C license would allow 254 devices. That's if you have not subnetted those. Okay, it would be even less if you subnet because you'd lose an address out of each subnet for the network and the broadcast numbers. Okay, so it does allow you to use, say, a Class B, which is what we use in our labs. We use a Class B license because that provides a lot more addresses, and then when we need to go outside of our network, we would use our Class C public license. So what else? Increases the flexibility of connections to the public network, consistency for network addressing schemes, and some security. Why does it provide some security? Well, have you ever tried to follow an address, and if you're following an address that changes, or if someone else is following an address that changes, then it would be harder to track that. So you have a private address inside your network, it's tracked, it changes to become a public address, and then changes back again. So the best example that I use in the classroom of that is, think about if you were to have the old movies, if you're watching some of the old spy movies, and people are changing clothes or they're changing cars. Okay, that obviously makes it a little bit harder to track than if they were wearing the same clothes and using the same car throughout the whole episode. Okay. So it might be a lame example, but that's the best one I can come up with off the top of my head. So what are some disadvantages of NAT? There are some disadvantages of NAT. Number one, it does take more resources. If you have this loaded on a router and you're having to use that translation. End-to-end functionality and traceability being lost. Again, think about following an address from one end to the other. It would be a lot harder. Okay, it does increase the security a little bit, but you lose some of that traceability. If you're trying to tunnel, it can be a little bit more complicated. That's beyond the scope of this course, but it can become a little bit more complicated. And some of your TCP connections can be a little bit disrupted sometimes with this. Now, how do you configure? If you're configuring static NAT, what you're going to do is use this phrase, IPNAT inside source static. It says that you are configuring it as a static address. Then you have your inside address and your outside address. Okay? Then you have to go into the interface that you want to specify as inside your network. Remember the diagram I showed you? And you had that NAT-enabled router. One interface was inside your network, one was outside your network. Well, you have to specify which one that is. So you go into the interface and say IPNAT inside on the inside interface. Then you go into the outside interface and specify that one as the outside enabled router. So if we're looking at the scenario here, here's that command, IPNAT inside source static 192.168.10.254, and we want it to always translate to 201.5. Then we go into this interface here, IPNAT inside, go into that interface and label it as IPNAT outside. So again, you're like combining kind of some of the stuff that we've done before into this. Okay. Click figure 4. This is where you just get to kind of try it yourself. Okay, so that's your static NAT. That's the first type. Now, if you want to verify to make sure that it works, these are the show commands that you use. Make sure you memorize these if you're planning on taking your CCNA exam, because you're going to need them. You probably won't have to configure NAT, but you'll have to know the show commands associated with them. So show IPNAT translations is definitely one that I would remember. And if you need to clear these out, you can do your clear IPNAT statistics. Show IPNAT statistics will show you how many static addresses, how many dynamic, how many extended. It'll show you the ones you've labeled as your inside and outside. Hits How many times has it gone through? So that'd be your static addresses. Now dynamic is where you're going to set up your pool. So when you're going in and configuring it, I'm going to go in and look at, I can tell a little bit by the commands. So you're going to define your pool of addresses. Your command here, IPNAT pool. Okay, so now we're creating ACLs. You're going to see this. Creating your pool. So you learn that in DHCP. You're creating an access list. You learn that with your ACLs. This is where all that stuff is kind of coming together that I was talking about. So define your pool, IPNAT pool. That's the actual command. NAT pool is the name of the pool that you're using. You have your first available address, your last available address, and the mask. And notice this is unusual. You have to type net mask and the mask that you're using. Okay, so that's a little bit different. Define which addresses are eligible to be translated. So what you're doing here, okay, the first step is, here's my pool. These are the public addresses that I want to use. The second step says, okay, these are the private addresses I'm going to allow to be translated into these public addresses. So access list 1, permit statement here, 192.168.0.0, and your wildcard mask. You're going to bind it together in the third step, IPNAT, inside source list 1 pool, NAT pool. Then you're going to go in and label your inside and outside interfaces. So those are the steps that are associated with doing your dynamic configuration. You can go in and look at that, and you can verify it using the same show commands that I showed you for the static, which is your show IPNAT command. There's show IPNAT translations, which will show you the translations. The verbose gives you a little bit more info there. You start seeing a few more statistics. If you're having issues, you don't think it's showing you everything, you can clear it out by doing the clear IPNAT translation space asterisk. You can also clear out the NAT translation on the inside itself. And you can do the clear IPNAT statistics. You can also do the show IPNAT statistics. So that shows you your dynamic NAT. So those are the first two. PAT is very similar to dynamic. With that, you're going to create a pool just like you did before. IPNAT pool, name your pool, your beginning and ending addresses, and the net mask, your permit statement. Then you're going to bind it together. So here is the only difference between the configuration part. You see the word overload here? So that is the difference between PAT and NAT so far as the configuration goes. The other thing that's kind of cool with PAT is that you can use a single address. Again, so we kind of looked at that earlier with your single address. If you're going to configure that, you can do that as well, doing it the same way. Just make sure you follow the steps to configure your PAT. And then you go in and use the same show commands. So here they're looking at the analysis between your servers. So show IPNAT statistics. And make sure you pay attention to the port numbers there. And clear IP statistics and show IPNAT statistics. So that is how you would go in and configure these. And then you get into some port forwarding and a little bit of wireless. This would be kind of like what you would use in your home. You see your wireless, your port forwarding for your router at home that you might use. So this kind of walks you through that. But the main thing I wanted to do is walk you through your static, dynamic, and your PAT. So I hope this helps. as always, let me know if you have any questions.